The existentialist Soren Kierkegaard wrestled night and day with the scriptures and the whole God question. And he would then go to church, having wrestled with it night and day, and he would say an old lady praying there. And then he would be exasperated because that little old lady had more faith than him. What do you make of the intellectual burden in which many of your guests over the past 17 years have had to carry when approaching the issue of the existence of God?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in some ways that's the right description of it. I think it can be a burden. I think people who are wired that way, often faith is difficult because they're wired to sort of pull things apart and examine things at a sort of logical level. And there's aspects of faith that kind of, it's difficult to do that to because, you're talking about something that at some level transcends purely intellectual, rational approach. And so, yeah, I've seen that frequently in the lives of people who are these deep thinkers. They are frequently the ones who are, as much as they can sort of come up with incredible, creative, compelling arguments for God, they're often also the ones who are assailed the most by doubts because they also see every flaw in their argument, along the way. I suppose I've always, at a simple level, I've always believed and seen that Christianity is a faith that is about the head and the heart. So for me, it's when those two come together that you have a kind of fully orbed Christian faith. And we were never meant to be Christian purely at an intellectual level. I don't think anyone comes to faith, comes into the kingdom, as it were, on the basis of purely on the basis of an argument. Though intellectual arguments may be an important part of the journey for some people who are wired that way, as I say. But in the end, yeah, faith is obviously going to be more than that. It's something about the heart. It's something about a movement towards God at a very deep level. And for many people, that is sort of the primary way in which they encounter God, I think. They just don't need, for whatever reason, a particularly intellectual approach. And I can understand why Kierkegaard sort of envied the woman at prayer who just didn't have all these sort of questions floating around her mind necessarily. And I also have been in that position myself where I've sort of, had a sleepless night over some big question. And I look at the person in the pew next to me and think, gosh, maybe they don't have to go through that. I think in a way, we need both though. I think the church is poorer when it's purely filled by people who experience God in some direct way, as wonderful as that is, but it doesn't have anyone who's sort of thinking about it and trying to make sense of it logically. And equally, if it was all just filled with philosophers and theologians, it would become very dry and stuffy. So I'm very open to that. And what's interesting to me so often is in the lives of some of these amazing thinkers. I think of Blaise Pascal, for instance, extraordinary intellect, mathematician, philosopher, very devout Christian, wrote some of the most extraordinary works of apologetics in his age, actually. But ultimately, it was this extraordinary experience of God that he said was the thing that grounded his faith. Not the God of the philosophers, as he said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, fire. And that was, what he had stitched into his jacket. Because, and that's sort of, kind of my story as well. I've kind of chased down a lot of these intellectual arguments and so on over the years. I've found it really helpful at some level in my own life. But my entry into faith was an experience, of God. It wasn't an intellectual argument. So I think we need to always be open to the fact that God sort of does transcend those things,
With that recognition that the experience of God is an emotional experience, do you find, or have you found over the past 17 years, that there's been too much reliance on the head over the heart, on the intelligence and not the emotion when facilitating these debates? And is that, do you think, why a lot of the time people are unable to get past a certain point of two interlocutors in a debate, that they just don't really make any progress because it's so head heavy, if that makes sense?
I think that's right. I think in a sense, though, if you're kind of inviting people into a debate, you're kind of setting the terms of the engagement anyway, and you're making it something about the head. So it would hardly be fair to criticize people for taking too much of a sort of head approach to things when you've invited them to debate some, technical subject, the Kalam cosmological argument or whatever. As I say, I think there's a value to that. I think traditional apologetics in that sense for some people is really important, because it is important to kind of sort out a lot of those questions. But as I say, it's not going to replace that sort of more experiential aspect that is an important aspect of faith as well. So, and I do think that probably, yeah, especially during the heyday of the New Atheism, which was very much geared at provoking these kinds of intellectual questions and objections, inevitably the pendulum kind of swung quite far towards engaging them on those terms, having these highly sort of, intellectual debates, these set pieces of, William Lane Craig versus Christopher Hitchens or whatever. And it probably gave the impression to a lot of people, especially non-Christians watching that, oh, this is what Christianity is. It's a sort of intellectual sparring match where the person with the best argument kind of wins the day. And of course, that is absolutely not what Christianity is. But it could easily give the impression that it is. And so I think that was a danger. And I think in a way, you by sort of playing by those rules, you do run the risk of turning Christianity into something that it isn't. I've been quite encouraged in a sense that a lot of people I've met who sort of maybe were involved in that important sort of apologetic response to the New Atheism are also recognizing actually there's also an important place for imagination and for mystery and for sort of not surrendering the intellect, but acknowledging that faith at some level transcends those things as well.